Welcome back to Cold Crime Cases, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Without further ado, let's get into it. Lynette White was a beautiful young woman from Cardiff, Wales, who was doing what she believed she had to do in order to get by. She dropped out of school and had been working as a prostitute since she was 14. Being a sex worker wasn't part of Lynette's childhood dream. Weeks before she was found dead, Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed her while investigating child prostitution. During the interview, she told Tim how she was drugged, taken to Bristol by a gang of men, and forced into prostitution. Yet, even after Lynette found her way back to Cardiff, she could not find her way out of prostitution. By 1988, Lynette, who was now 20 years old, was working the streets daily as a prostitute. Described as popular and pretty by friends, Lynette was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time. She was the first girl to be out at lunchtime and would be the last to leave at night. Working every day, rain or shine, even on Christmas, earning £100 per night. One would almost think White was working hard to have a better life. But that was not the case. It was all to pay for her boyfriend, Stephen Miller's, cocaine addiction. Every night, Miller took £60 to £90 from Lynette, who was his only source of income. Lynette lived with Miller in a flat on Dorset Street in Cardiff. Each day, Miller would drive her to Riverside in Cardiff, where she worked, and meet her later in the evening at the North Star Club to collect her earnings. It continued like that every day until February 9, 1988 was the last day Miller saw Lynette. She had not made contact with Miller or her friends in the days leading up to her death, which was very odd behavior for her. She was also due to make an appearance as a witness for 2 prosecution trials when she disappeared. No one knows the reason why White stopped contacting others 5 days prior to her death. The police thought she was deliberately hiding to avoid giving evidence and began to actively search for her. Earlier that same month, Leanne Vilde, Lynette's friend, had loaned Lynette her keys to a flat for the purpose of taking clients there for sex. On February 14, 1988, in the evening, Leanne, who probably wanted to use the flat, went there but found it locked, which was quite unusual. Lynette was nowhere to be found. Leanne became very worried about Lynette. She drove to Butetown Police Station to report her friend's disappearance. She returned to her James Street flat with 3 policemen who were expecting to serve an arrest warrant on Lynette and take her in. The policemen forced entry into the apartment and found Lynette lying there, in a pool of her own blood that a missing witness found dead with massive injuries. Who murdered Lynette White? According to the autopsy performed by pathologist Bernard Knight, Lynette had been stabbed over 50 times on her chest, face, stomach, wrist, breasts, arms, hands, and inner thighs. Her throat was also savagely slit from ear to ear. Though she was stabbed multiple times, the autopsy revealed that Lynette died from the throat injury. The pathologist also determined that Lynette was murdered on February 14th between 1:45 a.m. and 4 a.m. Lynette's body was found between the foot of the bed and the window, covered in blood. Azoospermic semen, which is semen containing no sperm, was found in her vagina and also on her underwear. There were 2 different blood types found on Lynette, her own blood and an AB-type blood, which did not belong to Lynette. Soon the news about Lynette's death had spread and police began to ask questions about the incident. Witnesses told the police that they saw a man looking distressed in the area where Lynette's body was found on James Street. The man looked very suspicious and he appeared to have blood on his hands. The suspicious man, described as a white male, approximately 5'8" to 5'10", and in his mid-30s, became the primary focus of the investigation. Efforts to find this man were exhaustive. Soon, they arrested a man that matched the suspect's description, but he was soon released after he presented his alibi. Police looked into Miller, Lynette's boyfriend, as the partner of a murder victim is usually the first obvious suspect. Miller was questioned but later released because his blood type didn't match the one found on Lynette. Because Lynette was supposed to appear as a witness against a man named Francine Cordell in court. Francine and his mother were investigated, but soon the 2 were eliminated as suspects because their blood also did not match the AB blood type found on Lynette. Very little is known about the case against Cordell or the other case that Lynette was set to give evidence in. Another suspect that piqued the investigators' interest was a man who was on a list of 12 persons of interest in the area due to their past criminal activity. He was a sex offender and a pedophile who lived close to James Street. His identity was concealed, and he was called Mr. X. When Mr. X was interviewed, he admitted to paying Lynette for sex in the past and was unable to account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Mr. X had blood type AB, which prompted the police to run a DNA test on him. When the results came back, it eliminated Mr. X from the investigation. Now, all that the police were left with were statements gathered from their door-to-door inquiry. Mick, who lived in the flat right above where Lynette was murdered, together with his friend Atkins, gave statements implicating each other in their accounts. But as the statements contained 4 completely different accounts, the investigators didn't take it seriously. Ronnie Williams, a police informant, also gave an account implicating his common-law brother-in-law, Yusef Abdullahi. He initially claimed Abdullahi knew the killer and later implicated him directly, saying Abdullahi was the killer. It was known to the police that the two detested each other. So again, investigators dismissed the account. Leanne Vilde, who reported Lynette's disappearance on the day she died, was also suspected and questioned. The police visited her daily to question her. The pressure was becoming too much for her to handle, and one day, while she was drunk, she named Miller and Abdullahi as the killers. Violet Perriam, a secretary at a Cardiff yacht club, also gave a statement about the incident. 8 months into the investigation, she came forward claiming that on February 14th, while driving home from the club at about 1:30 a.m., she saw 4 excited black males outside the building where Lynette was killed. She then identified 2 of them as John Akhti and Rashid Omar. Perriam's statement would give the case a new direction. Angela Sala, who is mildly mentally retarded, also gave a statement that she saw Miller, John Rashid, Ronnie Acton, John's cousin, Tony Paris, and Tony Brace outside 7 James Street on the day Lynette was murdered. This was exactly what police needed, as her account corroborated Perriam's statement. Further implicating Abdullahi, John, Miller, and the rest were Gromick and Atkins, who gave new statements on the same day with Sala. They said they also saw a group of men including Ronnie and Abdullahi. Sala then gave another statement in December 1988 that she heard a scream from Lynette's flat and rushed there with Vilde. Coincidentally, on the same day, Vilde also told the police that she went to the flat after she heard Lynette scream and met Miller, Abdullahi, Ronnie Akhti, Miller's brother, and an unnamed mixed-race man. Unfortunately for Sala, she had an AB blood type. Police insisted that her blood was found on Lynette's socks. She then gave a new statement that she was part of the killing together with Vilde and the other guys. Vilde also admitted that she was forced to cut Lynette's wrist to ensure her complicity in silence. Miller confessed to killing Lynette after 307 denials. He also implicated the other men named, which led to the arrest of all the men allegedly involved in the murder. On December 7, 1988, the police arrested Stephen and Tony Miller, Yusef Abdullahi, Ronnie Akhti, Rashid Omar, and Martin Tucker. On December 9, 1988, John Akhti and Tony Paris were also arrested. For close to a year, they were locked up until their trial began on October 5, 1989 at Swansea Crown Court. This trial became the longest murder trial in British legal history, lasting 197 days. After spending 2 years in custody, Ronnie and John Akhti were acquitted of the murder, while Tony Paris, Stephen Miller, and Yusef Abdullahi were found guilty. Each were sentenced to life imprisonment, and since then they're known as the Cardiff Three. Even though no forensic evidence linked these men to the crime scene, they were held as the criminals. However, there were a lot of doubts and questions about the convictions. Consequently, the friends and families of the Cardiff Three began a campaign to overturn the convictions. The campaign received massive support and was followed by television documentaries in 1992. By December 1992, the Cardiff Three's appeal was heard. After the Court of Appeal had listened to Miller's interrogation, Lord Taylor said the police had bullied Miller during the interview. "Get involved, you'll mess ties the truth." "I'm not involved. I'm saying that. I'm not involved." "Well, why should somebody put you there?" "I don't know. I've been telling you all that I've done." "I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know what they put me in there for." Therefore, the truthfulness of Miller's admission was irrelevant. The card of three were free at last. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory by Lord Taylor. But if the card of three didn't commit the crime, it means the real criminal was still roaming free. It brings us to yet the same question: who murdered Lynette White? 8 years later, the case was reopened. This time, Professor Dave Barkley and Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill were assigned to the task. The case took the officers back to the crime scene. By then, it was already 12 years since the incident happened. While examining the old crime scene photographs, Professor Barkley's eyes caught something that no one else saw in all these years. It was a large drop of blood believed to have been thrown from a knife onto the wallpaper. When the crime was committed in 1988, police removed lots of wallpaper in the flat to be stored as evidence. Upon searching through the old wallpaper evidence, they discovered that the only missing piece of wallpaper was the one that contained the large drop of blood. The forensic scientist didn't give up, though. He continued to study the crime scene photos and realized the blood could have dropped on the skirting board beneath. Underneath several layers of paint, the team found the blood completely sealed in and dry. Traces of the blood were also found on a piece of cellophane wrapper from a cigarette pack. Since then, the detectives and scientists dubbed the suspect Cellophane Man. The forensics team, led by Angela Gallup, got to work. But shockingly, the DNA profile was not found in any of the 140 police databases. But when the police searched for similar profiles, it was narrowed to just hundreds in the Cardiff area. Using the approach of familial DNA searching, a partial match was eventually made with the profile of a 14-year-old boy. This boy was known to the police as he was once arrested for joyriding in Cardiff. But could he be the Cellophane Man? If you thought about his age, then your guess was right. He wasn't even born when the incident happened. At that time, the case was 15 years old. Notwithstanding, the police had to visit his house. When they got there, they were told that the boy's father was dead, but he had an uncle, Jeffrey Gaffer. On February 26, 2003, detectives pulled up at Jeffrey's home, a semi-detached house in the village of Lanherne 15 miles west of Cardiff, but no one was home. The following day, they checked at Jeffrey's place of work, an office block in Cardiff city centre, where he worked as the security guard. When the police explained the reason for their visit, Jeffrey said, "Oh, I thought you got some guys for that." He was asked to provide a mouth swab and he complied. Immediately, police checked the swab. They had finally caught the Cellophane Man. Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill was determined to do things right this time. He put a surveillance team on Jeffrey while he made preparations for the interview. Chief O'Neill had plans to put surveillance on Jeffrey for a whole week. But on February 28, 2003, Jeffrey made a crazy move. The surveillance team spotted him at a garage where he bought 3 packets of paracetamol, an over-the-counter pain reliever. By the time the police got to Jeffrey's house, he had taken about 62 paracetamols. Jeffrey denied ever taking those tablets, but he announced, just for the record, "I did kill Lynette White. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens, I deserve it. I sincerely hope to die." He was taken to the hospital where he told a staff member that he was being watched because of a murder he committed 15 years ago. Jeffrey was prepared to die as he initially refused to be treated. He eventually agreed to take an antidote. Within a few days, he had recovered. On July 4, 2003, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder, and the judge, Justice Royce, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 12 years and 8 months. Jeffrey's barrister said Jeffrey killed Lynette over 30 pounds for sex. He said Jeffrey wanted his money back when he changed his mind. In February 2007, Atkins, Sala, Vilde, and Gromick were charged with perjury. By December 2008, Sala, Vilde, and Gromick were found guilty and sentenced to 18 months of imprisonment each. Atkins was exempted because it was believed that he was bullied, threatened, abused, and manipulated to admit to false accounts suggested to him. In March 2009, it was announced that there was enough evidence to prosecute the police officers involved in the initial investigation with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. In February 2011, the trial collapsed due to missing evidence. In February 2015, 8 of the 15 charged officers cleared of perverting the course of justice launched a high court civil action against the force, suing for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment, and misfeasance. But at the end of February 2015, the judge in the civil action dismissed their case. The 5 falsely accused men were compensated after their release. Stephen Miller was paid £571,000. John Actie was paid £300,000, while Tony Paris was paid £250,000. Ron Actie died in February 2007 after much struggle to cope with what had happened to him. Youssef Abdullahi also died in 2011 of perforated cancer. He too had battled with post-traumatic stress disorder. On December 10, 1976, 81-year-old World War I veteran George Clarence Seitz left his house to get a nice haircut in a nearby barbershop in Jamaica, Queens. The old man mysteriously vanished into thin air, leaving behind no clues. Where did he go after leaving the house? What could have happened to him after setting out to do a harmless daily chore? The answer to these questions would remain a mystery for 4 decades. Today's story takes us to Jamaica, a small neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens. Jamaica offers a vibrant tinge of authenticity. Being one of the most ethnically diverse counties of Queens, New York, Jamaica was the longtime home of a solitary World War I veteran named George Clarence Seitz. 81-year-old Seitz, who went by Clarence, was a dedicated soldier who fought for his country in his youth during World War I. Once retired, he preferred to keep his life private and lived alone in a nice home. Though it seemed from the outside that the war veteran lived his life on his own terms, Seitz's life was not free from complications. Just like thousands of others, the vulgar brutality of war had a lasting impact on him. Seitz developed severe PTSD and paranoia due to his time serving in the military. He was extremely reclusive and did not trust anybody. He would regularly dress up in business attire as if he were heading out for an office. Instead, he'd just roam around the neighborhood. The situation was so bad that Seitz did not even trust banks and routinely kept wads of cash on him whenever he set foot outside his house. He'd pull out a large roll of cash when it came time to pay for something. Despite this, his mental faculties were intact. The elderly Seitz never overlooked his daily chores. He was a man of discipline. His clothes were always clean and crisp, his house always clean, his hair always cut, and he presented an all-around neat appearance. No one could ever have imagined that he'd simply disappear one day while performing such a mundane task. Around 10 a.m. on December 10, 1976, Seitz headed out to a nearby barbershop for a haircut, which was just 2.5 blocks away from his home located at 116th Street in Jamaica. That day, he did not return home, nor the next day or the day after that. He was never heard from again. It was not until 5 days had passed after Seitz's mysterious disappearance that his family reported him missing. Though authorities began their search immediately, there was not much to go on. He left absolutely no clues behind, not a trace. Investigators could only speculate as to what could have happened to him. Deputies conducted several interviews in an attempt to glean some information, but the leads were too thin to follow up on. Authorities at the time didn't even know if he even made it to the barbershop or not. The case quickly turned cold. Over the years, the Queens County Sheriff's Office collaborated with the NYPD and FBI, making numerous efforts to solve it, but they could never unravel the mystery. After lying dormant for decades, finally there was an unexpected breakthrough which turned the case white-hot. In February, a woman in her 50s called the 102nd Precinct Detective Squad to report a crime that occurred decades ago. She was an eyewitness to a horrific murder and carried the secret with her for more than 4 decades. The call was picked up by Queens South homicide detective Eric Contreras. At the time, he was just 31 years old. He'd been a cop for 9 years and a detective for 3. He was a young and dedicated detective. He was juggling multiple cases at the time, as most detectives do. Contreras was born 12 years after Seitz went missing, but he took a lot of interest in the case from the beginning. The details the woman provided sent chills down the spines of the detectives. She claimed that when she was just 11 years old, she witnessed her mother's boyfriend cutting up a body and burying the body parts in the backyard of a Queens home where she was living back in December of 1976. Although she could not identify the victim, she vividly remembered the details and gave the detectives an exact location. When asked why she stayed silent all those years, she said she was afraid of reprisals. but in the end came forward because she could no longer live with the burden. The mother's boyfriend was identified as Martin Mata, a long-time resident of Jamaica. Interestingly, Martin Mata owned a barbershop called Haircutter along with his brother, which was located on 161st Street in Jamaica. The barbershop was only in operation from the late 1970s to the 1980s. It had been the last known destination of George Seitz, who was a regular customer there. Mata was only 29 years old in 1976 when Seitz went missing. The barbershop was shut down shortly after the incident. However, detectives did not immediately connect the murder to Seitz, who went missing during the same time frame that the woman had estimated. Despite the unbelievable story, the woman's account was so detailed that they decided to begin a thorough search of the property. On March 12, 2019, the investigators raided a house at 8772A 115th Street, Richmond Hill, Queens that belonged to Martin Mata, only 2.5 miles away from the now-closed barbershop. Based on the description of the witness, police focused their search for remains in the backyard guarded with a wooden fence. Cadaver dogs first scoured the backyard, and after they confirmed a location, forensic anthropologists from the Emergency Services Unit began excavating. It didn't take long for the searchers to discover partial human remains in a makeshift grave buried underneath concrete that had been poured on top of it, the exact spot where the witness had stated it would be. Unfortunately, only a pelvis and part of the torso were recovered from the scene, as the rest of the body had been dismembered at the neck, shoulders, and hips. NYPD investigators turned to genetic DNA technology to identify the victim, but there seemed to be a problem with the scenario. At the time, New York state law only allowed police to use that method when seeking to identify a suspect, not a victim. The FBI agreed to assist in the investigation since they had no such limitation under federal statute. The Queens County District Attorney's Office, along with the NYPD and the NYC FBI office, contacted Othram, an independent laboratory with expertise in genetic genealogy and DNA sequencing, to identify people. The lab was asked to perform advanced DNA testing that would lead to the identity of the homicide victim. Despite the level of decomposition of the remains, Othram was able to extract DNA from the bones and develop a complete DNA profile. Unfortunately, the profile did not match anyone in the local, state, or national databases. To unfold the mystery of the victim's identity, the DNA profile was used to perform a comprehensive genealogical search and to create a family tree through genetic matches. Luckily, the result came up suggesting that the victim's family members were still living in Ohio and California. The Queens South Homicide Squad detectives Contreras and Gaines immediately flew out to Ohio to speak with them. The family immediately knew that this had to do with their missing relative. They went on to tell the detectives how George Seitz had vanished after setting off to get a haircut. The question of what had happened to him had stayed with their family ever since. The body was positively identified as George Clarence Seitz from the DNA provided by his family. They also provided a picture of him as a young soldier in uniform. Upon further investigation using NYPD archives and microfiche, detectives were able to find a missing person report for George Seitz from 1976. To tighten the loose ends, an age-progressed photo was created from the picture Seitz's family provided. The witness confirmed it to be the person she saw being dismembered by Martin Mata. Finally, after over 40 years, the family had some answers. The only question that remained was the motive. It was theorized that Moto fatally stabbed Sykes in the head soon after he reached the barbershop and robbed him of $7,000 to $8,000, as he knew about his customers' habits of keeping a large sum of cash with him. People would see the money he had on him, Detective Contreras later said. The extensive investigation lasted for 2 years and spanned over 5 states since the witness first came forward. In November 2021, 75-year-old Martin Mata was arrested from a Jamaica home where the homeowner says Mata would stay sometimes as a favor to a friend of a friend. He was brought into the Queens County District Attorney's Office and arraigned on a charge of intentional murder and remanded. However, no other charges can be brought due to the expiry of the statute of limitations. In October of 2022, Mota pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced on November 7, 2022 for 20 years in prison for the 1976 slaying. After 46 years of eluding justice, Martin Mota is being held accountable for his merciless deeds. Though it does not erase the agony Seitz's family was put through, we can only hope that the identification of the remains and the indictment of his killer will bring some peace to his loved ones. For almost 2 decades, Keith Hall hid a big secret from the world. He was a well-known pimp and a drug addict, but there was an even darker side to him that no one knew about. In February 2002, Keith murdered 19-year-old Rachel Wilson, whom he had been in a toxic relationship with. A series of lies to the authorities helped him to successfully cover his tracks. But when Rachel's bones turned up several years later, it was game over for him. This story will take us to Middlesbrough, England. This town was once a farm that was home to less than 30 people. With time, the area became industrialized and more populated. Now, it's famous for its football club and transporter bridge. Unfortunately, sex trafficking has also been a major problem plaguing Middlesbrough. Teenage girls as young as 16 can be found working as prostitutes. Rachel Wilson is described by her family as full of life, fun, and cheeky. It seemed as if she had her whole life ahead of her and nothing could possibly go wrong. The Rachel we remember was very happy and bubbly. She was amazing. Nicola Wilson, Rachel's younger sister, told the media. We went everywhere together and were really close. However, meeting Keith Hall at the age of 16 would mark a turning point in her life. Keith was more than 20 years older than her, yet despite this, an unlikely relationship developed between the two. It was obvious from the beginning that their relationship was heading for disaster, but Rachel didn't know any better. Keith was able to take advantage of her innocence, and in no time, he introduced her to a world of hard drugs, specifically cocaine. Rachel soon became heavily dependent on the stimulant. She went from being the greatest sister ever to someone ruled by her addiction. Carl, Rachel's younger brother, said, "She always promised me she would come off the drugs though. She promised she would be off them by my 18th birthday." Rachel's life began to gradually spin out of control due to the level of influence Keith was having on her. At some point, he decided to kick things up a notch. They needed money to fund their lifestyle, and Keith saw prostitution as the perfect opportunity to bring in that money. He soon talked Rachel into selling her body for money, and because of her addiction, Rachel had no choice but to oblige. She was soon working most nights on the streets of Middlesbrough to fuel both her and Keith's drug habit. Yet despite her sacrifice, Keith still wasn't satisfied. At times, she brought in less money than he expected. Whenever this occurred, he'd become violent. Rachel was suffering both physical and emotional abuse at the hands of the man she'd chosen to trust. She was growing increasingly more afraid of him as his violent, erratic behavior continued to escalate. Rachel's family did not fail to notice the change in her. They became aware of her drug addiction and saw how it was affecting her. Physically, she was getting thinner and looking like a ghost of her former self. However, they had no idea what she was going through at the hands of Keith. She went to great lengths to hide the abuse. She was always happy, even though we knew she was struggling. Rachel was a loving daughter and an all-around cheeky teenager. Rachel's mother, Tina Wilson, said. Her family eventually sought medical help to combat her addictions. However, their intervention was a little too late. On May 30th, 2002, Rachel paid a visit to her sister, Nicola. That visit was not unusual in any way. At the time, Nicola had just given birth to a baby girl, and Rachel had been going daily to spend quality time with her sister and the new baby. The visit was just like any other. After some time well spent with her sister and niece, they said their goodbyes. That same evening, she also spent time with her mother and other family members. They all went to a fair, and by 11 p.m., Rachel went on her way. That was the last time any of her family members saw her alive. A few days later, Rachel's family were getting increasingly concerned that they hadn't heard from her. This was unlike Rachel, who, despite her lifestyle, was very close with her family. They went in search of Rachel at her apartment and other places she was known to frequent, yet there was no sign of her. It was as if she had left town entirely. Rachel had her own flat, but she always kept in touch. Sometimes we'd wonder where she was, but she'd always turn up a couple of hours later. Nicola had later said about her sister's disappearance. Eventually, Her family involved the police, and a full-scale search for the missing teenager was soon launched. Police questioned Keith and was asked about his whereabouts around the time Rachel disappeared. Keith told authorities that Rachel had run off with a man she'd met at a local fair. He maintained he had no idea what became of her after that. Unfortunately, investigators had no tangible evidence to go on. The only lead the police had was CCTV footage of Rachel. She was last seen on CCTV walking down Southfield Road, Middlesbrough. This was around 7:02 a.m. on May 31, 2002. In the days that followed, the search for Rachel intensified, but there was still no trace of her. The search continued for 16 months, and in that period, police and Rachel's mother made several appeals to the public for information regarding Rachel's disappearance. They feared the worst, but there was really nothing to confirm that she was dead. Her entire family was thrown into a state of confusion. They had no idea what had become of their beloved Rachel. Her mother, in particular, held out hope that her daughter was out there and would make her way back home and walk through the door at any minute. "Rachel, if you see this, you know you can get in touch anytime, day or night," Tina Wilson had said in one of her appeals a few years after her daughter's sudden disappearance. In February 2005, Rachel's brother, Benji Hopkins, died from an antidepressant overdose. According to the family, Benji's death had much to do with Rachel's disappearance. He and Rachel had been very close, and her sudden disappearance had taken a huge toll on his death. Benji's death was a huge blow to the family, who was left to deal with another loss. On June 27, 2012, a group of men were working on a farm located on the outskirts of Middlesbrough when they unearthed human bones. The bones were found buried in a shallow grave. Police were contacted, and they immediately set out trying to uncover the identity of the body. Rachel's family was also made aware of the development, since there was a likely chance that the remains were Rachel's. After 2 weeks, the results of the analysis carried out on the bones had come back. A police spokeswoman revealed the findings, saying, "Police have now identified the body found on farmland on the outskirts of Middlesbrough a few weeks ago and can confirm that it's that of Rachel Wilson, who went missing just over 10 years ago." Rachel's family was broken by the news. "It was a really painful couple of weeks, but I just knew it was her. Even though we had to wait, I knew it was her," Nicholas said at the time our family found out that Rachel was dead and gone forever. Her brother Carl was quoted as saying, "When we were told, we were devastated. It was heartbreaking to think that she had been just a bus journey away from us that whole time." Rachel's mother, of course, was beyond devastated. But she was also somewhat relieved that her daughter had finally been found. "At last, she's coming home. That's all I ever wanted. Obviously, I wanted the circumstances to be different and for her to be coming home alive," her mother Tina said. Preparation for Rachel's funeral was set into motion. The bereaved family received huge support from the community, and a fundraiser was even held to generate money for the funeral. Rachel was finally buried alongside her brother Benji a few months after her remains were found. Yet there were still so many questions that continued preying on the minds of investigators as well as Rachel's family. How had Rachel met her end, and who had been her killer? The examination of Rachel's remains had not revealed anything that could have led to her death. The only thing the investigators knew was that there was no clothing where her bones had been discovered, and this meant that she had been buried naked. Temporary Detective Superintendent Paula Jewell, who had investigated Rachel's death, explained, "We couldn't establish a cause of death because the remains were just skeletal and there was no forensic evidence left at the scene." She added, "Whilst it was a significant development to find someone who'd been missing for 10 years, it didn't give us the lines of inquiry we thought we'd get." Investigators began working around the clock to uncover what had happened to Rachel. But before they could make significant progress, Rachel's father, Bernard Wilson, tragically died. This was another tragic shock for the family. All Bernard wanted was to know what had happened to his daughter, and it's devastating that he went to his grave not knowing. Tina had said about Bernard's death, "In 2014, police finally made a breakthrough in the case. A suspect was named, and it was none other than Keith Hall." Keith, who was 54 at the time, was arrested and questioned regarding Rachel's death. A search of his property was also conducted, and police discovered some incriminating items. Part of what was found was a lock of Rachel's hair and a handwritten note from her. The note, which was addressed to Keith, was believed to have been written just a few hours before her disappearance. In the note, she had apologized to Keith for not making enough money. The note, together with a lock of hair, would later serve as a major piece of evidence against Keith. He was later released on bail, since there was no concrete evidence to prove that he had a hand in Rachel's death. However, he remained a prime suspect in the case. Over the next couple of years, Keith became a regular visitor to the police station. Yet each time he was asked about Rachel's death, he kept leading investigators in circles. In February 2018, a special grant was provided for the investigation unit of the police department. This was done so that more efforts could be channeled towards solving Rachel's murder. In the months that followed, investigators paid visits to several sex workers who had been around at the time of Rachel's disappearance. The number of these sex workers totaled about 500. It was time-consuming work, but gradually progress was being made. A lot of witnesses we spoke to were in the sex industry and didn't want to go back and relive some of the worst periods of their life, so it was very difficult. But thankfully, some very brave people came forward and told their story, Detective Duell recalled. Many of these witnesses pointed out the toxic relationship that had existed between Keith and Rachel. They revealed how Keith had led her into prostitution and how he was in the habit of hitting her whenever she brought in less money than expected. These acts of violence were said to sometimes leave her covered in bruises. Another witness also came forward and revealed to the police some incriminating things Keith had said right after Rachel's bones were found. According to the witness, Keith had told him that he had killed Rachel. With all of these revelations, it became more obvious to the police that Keith was the man they were looking for. Their suspicion was confirmed. They knew from the start that there was something fishy about Keith, but lacked strong evidence to charge him with anything. Finally, the walls were closing in on him and a strong case was being built up. In addition to the accounts of the witnesses, investigators also sat through several hours of CCTV footage that was recorded around the time of Rachel's disappearance. From the footage, detectives noticed a purple Vauxhall combo van moving around the Middlesbrough area. This van was believed to have been used in Rachel's murder. Upon further investigation, they were able to link the vehicle to Keith. With all this evidence, investigators were able to come up with a rough idea of how Rachel had met her end. They believed that after Rachel left her family on the day she was last seen, she'd worked throughout the night as usual. At some point, she met up with Keith, who had been disappointed by her earnings for that day. When Keith confronted her, he resorted to his usual physical abuse. Investigators surmised that this time around he went too far and ended up beating her to death. When he realized what he'd done, he decided that it was best to cover up his tracks. Authorities believed he waited a few days and after the murder loaded her lifeless body into his van and drove off to the farm where her bones were found 10 years later. This was what authorities believed anyway. It's not clear if things happened exactly that way since Keith never gave an account of how or why he killed Rachel. In December 2019, Keith was charged with the murder of Rachel Wilson. In addition to this, he was also charged with living off of immoral earnings and perverting the course of justice, the latter due to him trying to influence a key witness to lie to the police. Despite all of the evidence that pointed to him as Rachel's killer, Keith maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty. After this, a trial date was set for June 3, 2020, but due to the coronavirus pandemic, it was shifted to October 6 that same year. The trial date was once again changed until May 11, 2021 was finally agreed upon. On the day his trial was due to start, he finally confessed that he was responsible for Rachel's death. He denied the charge of murder but pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which was a lesser charge. He also pleaded guilty to the other 2 charges brought against him. After his admission of guilt, a spokesperson for the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for prosecuting criminal cases, spoke to the media about the reasons why Keith's plea for manslaughter was accepted. He revealed that the case had been an extremely challenging one, and because Rachel's remains were discovered after more than a decade, it was impossible to identify the cause of death or the motive behind it. A murder charge would have required that the intent be proven. As a result of Keith Hall's acceptance that he was responsible for Rachel's death alongside other evidential factors, the case was again reviewed and a decision taken that a plea to manslaughter was acceptable, the spokesperson said. He added, A guilty plea to manslaughter means that Keith Hall has been convicted of killing Rachel and disposing of her body, and our decision was carefully taken following consultation with both the police and Rachel's family. On November 1, 2021, Keith was sentenced to 18.5 years in jail for manslaughter, living off the proceeds of prostitution and perverting the course of justice. This was a relief to Rachel's family, who had waited for 19 long years to get justice for her. It's difficult to feel any sense of happiness with this result when at the heart of this inquiry is a 19-year-old vulnerable girl who lost her life in extremely tragic circumstances. Detective Duell had later said after the sentencing, "With Keith in jail, Rachel's family were able to take the first step towards moving forward. However, Nicola revealed that the road ahead would still be very difficult for the family. She stated it will be some kind of closure, but I don't think it will ever be complete closure for us because our nightmare is ongoing." She added, "I'd like Rachel to be remembered as the funny, cheeky girl that she always was. That part of her life was such a short period. There was so much more." Nancy Marie Benelac was born in Nevada, California on June 13, 1942. After spending her childhood in Nevada, she moved to Sacramento and worked as a court reporter. In 1970, 28-year-old Nancy was living alone with her cat on the second story of an apartment complex on Bell Street in Sacramento. While working in Sacramento County Court, Nancy met and fell in love with Ferris Salome. Salome was chief public defender in the Sacramento District Court. They were engaged to be married, with the wedding scheduled for November 28, 1970. Just a month before the wedding, the couple spent their evening having fun before heading back to Nancy's apartment. Nancy quickly fell asleep, so Salome decided to go back to his home. At around 11:30 p.m. Salome left the apartment. Before leaving, he left the sliding glass door ajar so that Nancy's cat could come and go as it pleased in the night, which Nancy often did herself. He never imagined this simple act would put his fiancée in horrible danger. The next morning on October 26, 1970, when Nancy did not show up for work, her co-workers grew concerned as she never missed work. One of her co-workers sent her son to check up on Nancy. When no one opened the door, even after repeated knocks, he reached out to the building manager. Together, the building manager and the co-worker's son discovered a heinous crime scene after entering the apartment with a passkey. Nancy was lying dead in a pool of her own blood in her bed. She had been ruthlessly stabbed over 30 times. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated that she tried desperately to fight off the attacker. The assault was so savage that her head was nearly decapitated. Authorities were alerted and they arrived a few minutes later. Blood was everywhere, but no fingerprints were found inside the apartment, indicating that the murderer had probably concealed their fingers to avoid leaving fingerprints. A long blood trail was also discovered, which started from the second-story balcony continuing to the sidewalk below and around the apartment complex buildings, which ended in the apartment complex parking lot. Investigators at that time believed that the attacker got into the apartment by climbing up to the balcony and then attacked and killed her. They surmised that the perpetrator must have gained access to the apartment by climbing up to the balcony and came in through the sliding glass door. They also theorized that this person had gotten injured during the attack, after which they climbed down. Based on the blood trail, the culprit would then have gotten into a vehicle in the complex parking lot and left. Nearly 500 people from the nearby area were questioned, but detectives had no suspects in their sights. Despite the efforts from law enforcement, the case grew cold. Although blood evidence was present there at the crime scene, it was not enough to apprehend the culprit. In the 70s, science was limited to the modern technology of 50 years ago, and only a blood type could be determined from someone's blood, and that's about it. In February 2004, a DNA profile was developed from the blood collected from the crime scene and was uploaded to the state and national CODIS databases, but no match was found. Then, after nearly 50 years, in November 2019, detectives from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office re-examined the cold case using forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that was employed to identify the notorious Golden State Killer. The DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogy website to find possible suspects. Finally, on July 21, 2022, the murderer of Nancy Marie Benelac was identified as Richard John Davis. Richard John Davis was born on the March 22, 1943. In 1970, 27-year-old Richard Davis lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy. While Nancy lived in apartment number 17, Davis lived in number 23. They were on opposite ends of a pool, and Nancy's apartment could be seen across the pool from Davis's apartment. Among the 500 people, both Davis and his roommate were interviewed by the sheriff's office during the initial investigation. However, each provided alibis for one another. Davis had no previous convictions except for a driving under the influence charge, so his DNA had never been uploaded to the Cody's database. No motive for the murder has been mentioned, but the murder did appear to be premeditated, according to investigators, due to the killer's choice of placing masking tape over his fingertips, which clearly indicated this was a premeditated attack. Nancy was not close to Davis. The only connection they could find between Davis and Nancy was the apartment complex they both lived in. However, investigators now believe that Davis stalked Nancy and was jealous about her getting married to a decent man weeks later. Apparently, this jealousy and rage are what motivated him to break into her apartment and kill her. The revelation was bittersweet to Nancy's family, as Davis died on November 2, 1997 at 54 years of age due to complications from alcoholism. However, they were relieved to finally know who was responsible for Nancy's death. On June 30, 1972, Donald and Joyce Heert were blessed with a beautiful baby girl. They named their daughter Stephanie Lynn Heert. The middle-class family lived in a suburban neighborhood along the Mississippi River in Waggaman, Louisiana. In May of 1978, Stephanie graduated from kindergarten at Live Oak Manor Elementary School. Shortly after that, schools were dismissed for summer break. Kids were riding bikes back and forth from their homes to friends' homes, to convenience stores to buy treats, to explore wherever their little feet could pedal to, so long as they were back home when the streetlights came on, as was a common rule in those innocent times. Days before her 6th birthday, on June 13, 1978, Stephanie checked into her house to grab lunch. She had spent the previous night at her friend Lizzie's home. Around 2:30 p.m., after having a bite to eat, she again left her home to go to the house of another friend, Lorie, who lived just a few doors away. As it was a safe community, she went alone. This was the last time anybody saw Stephanie. She never made it to her friend's house. Authorities were notified, and they immediately started searching for the little girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and baby blue-rimmed glasses. More than 100 deputies and 50 volunteers relentlessly searched for Stephanie on foot through the dense woods and swampy areas surrounding the subdivision. Helicopters were also flown over those woods to scan the whole area. They even called for heavy equipment to help give searchers access to areas covered in underbrush and vegetation. Her mother, Joyce, was quoted as saying during the search, "This is hell. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, not even the devil." Initially, it was believed that Stephanie simply walked away and got lost on her own. But when she was not found after 72 hours of extensive searching, it was concluded that there had been a kidnapping. A single lead developed during the search. A local ice cream truck vendor said between 4:30 and 5 p.m. on the same day Stephanie disappeared, he sold 2 sticks of cotton candy to a girl that looked like her, accompanied by a woman wearing heavy makeup. Around 5:30 p.m., an 8-year-old neighbor boy had also seen Stephanie with a woman of similar description about 4 blocks from the Hebert home. However, no such woman could be found even after a thorough search, and the lead fizzled out. As the days passed into months, the chances of getting her back alive were slim. All efforts fell short. Sadly, 5 months later, on the week before Thanksgiving, a hunter made an awful discovery. About 20 miles away from her home in a remote wooded area of St. Charles Parish, a tiny skeleton was found tied to a willow tree with a rope. Her glasses, shoes, and clothing were scattered nearby except for her underwear. The remains were identified as 5-year-old Stephanie Heert. Although an exact cause of death could not be determined, investigators believed she was still alive when she was left there to be eaten by creatures and consumed by the elements. As little Stephanie was laid to rest, investigators could not fathom what kind of monster could be capable of committing this horrendous crime. There were several suspects throughout the years, but none could be prosecuted due to the lack of solid evidence. The case soon turned cold. In February 2012, a courageous victim came forward with some truly shocking information about her own sexual assault back in 1979. After the revelation, Daniel Parks emerged as a new suspect in Stephanie's murder. Daniel Parks lived only 8 houses down from where Stephanie lived when she was murdered. He raped a then 7-year-old local girl around the same time as Stephanie's disappearance. This was the same girl who came forward with the information in 2012. The girl was friends with Stephanie and remembered Parks threatening her, saying that she might end up like Stephanie. In the police interrogation, Parks confessed to the rape as well as the comment about Stephanie, but later recanted his confession. He maintained that he had incorrectly implicated himself in the crime due to his condition of diabetes. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated rape and was sentenced to life in prison. He remained the suspect of Stephanie's murder for many years, but was never charged with a murder. Authorities set their sights on another suspect after Jason Franklin Jr., 50, referred to as Jay, came forward in February 2012 to reveal the sexual and physical abuse he suffered at his own father's hands. His father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a resident of the same community as Stephanie in 1978. Jay went on to divulge an even more disturbing story from his childhood. He claimed that both of his parents were involved in Stephanie's abduction, and that he, at 6 years old, was not only a witness, but was used as bait to lure the young girl in. Jay told the investigators that his father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a serial predator of young children, and sometimes he was forced to watch and even take part in the abuse. According to Jay, Stephanie was one of those victims. Jay claimed that Jason raped Stephanie on 3 separate occasions before her murder. Jay also revealed that it was Joyce Vinay, his mother, who abducted Stephanie Heert and brought her to her ex-husband, Jason Franklin Sr. Though the two were divorced, Vinay still loved Jason Franklin Sr. and would often help in his husband's sick activities. On June 13, 1978, Vinay lured Stephanie into their car and drove her to a house in Luling, where Jason was waiting. At some point, Jason put Stephanie into a car and told his former wife to follow. They drove to the swampy area where Stephanie's body would later be found. Jason stripped Stephanie of her clothes and took Polaroid photos while forcing Jay to pose with her. On previous occasions, Stephanie had kept her mouth shut about the abuse, but Finey argued with Jason about whether this might be a step too far. Stephanie threatened to tell her father this time. Jay recalled her tearful declaration, "I am telling Daddy," a comment that perhaps sealed her fate. Jason witnessed his father straddling Stephanie, tying her to the tree as they pulled away. He even led investigators to the exact area where Stephanie had been found. When detectives confronted Vinay, she denied involvement and called her son a liar. Despite Jay Franklin's testimony, it still took authorities years to prepare a case due to a lack of physical evidence. They had to determine whether the testimony was admissible and what charges Jason would be eligible for. In February 2018, Jason Franklin Sr., 76, was finally arrested and charged with Stephanie's murder. Unfortunately, Joyce has never been charged due to a lack of evidence. Donald and Joyce Hebert lived long enough to see Jason Franklin Sr. arrested. Although they both died in 2020, hopefully they died in peace knowing their daughter's killer had been put away. However, the case was abruptly halted in January 2022 after Jason died of a respiratory illness while in prison. The investigation of this 44-year-old cold case was officially closed after Jay Franklin, the main witness, was killed by an alleged drunk driver in June 2022. For 42 years, Irene Wilkawitz waited to discover the identity of her sister Eve's killer. It was 4 decades of constant fear, not knowing if she too would be the victim of a murder. Eve Wilkawitz was a 20-year-old woman living in Bayshore, New York. She was working as a secretary at a publishing house. She was reported missing after failing to return home from a night out. Her body was found in a yard mere blocks from her apartment. She was kidnapped, raped, and strangled to death after taking a late-night train back from Manhattan. For Eve's sister Irene, the case haunted her for her entire life. She was just 17 years old, when police arrived at their family home to deliver the devastating news. Irene never gave up the fight to find who killed her sister. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a celebrity. She was my sister, and she matters, said Irene. Eve was born on April 17, 1959. A Long Island native, Eve grew up in Oakdale, New York. After her mother's passing from cancer in 1977, she soon moved out of the family home and into her own apartment. Here she lived with a roommate, Robert Grogan, for 2 years. Friends described her as vibrant with a heart as big as her dreams. She was working for a popular publishing house in Manhattan and frequently commuted by train. It took her 2 trips of an hour and 45 minutes each to get to work and return home daily. In 1980, though, Grogan remembered Eve mentioning a feeling of uneasiness. She told him about a couple of men that would follow her from the train station. One man had been pestering her to go out for a date, which she declined. A second followed her for the entire 10-minute walk back to their shared apartment. These pests eventually fell away, and Eve went on to meet a young writer named Jack Dempsey. On March 21, 1980, Jack and Eve spent the evening together in the city. They watched a movie and had dinner before going back to his apartment. Before falling asleep, she asked Jack to wake her up in time to catch the 12:45 a.m. train back to Long Island. The morning of March 22, 1980, Jack walked Eve to the train station. He'd offered to take the train with her, but she waved him off, telling him she'd be fine. He watched her board the Long Island Railroad train. He never saw Eve alive again. By 7 a.m. that morning, her roommate Robert noticed Eve did not return home. He hadn't initially reported anything until the evening when no one could make contact with her. Together with family and friends, calls were made to local hospitals asking if they'd admitted anyone fitting Eve's description. There was no sighting of Eve anywhere, and panic began to settle in. A woman living just 3 blocks from Eve's apartment made a gruesome discovery in her neighbor's yard on the morning of March 25, 1980. Eve's lifeless body was found on the lawn of another neighbor. She was wearing blue jeans and a blouse. Her shoes and socks were missing. Police were called to the scene and soon discovered rope marks on her wrists, suggesting she'd been bound at some point. Police speculated she may have been held captive and sexually assaulted before being strangled to death and dumped just blocks from her apartment. When Eve's family were informed of her untimely passing, the trauma of her violent end would go on to haunt her sister Irene for the next 42 years. Investigations began, but leads were far and few. Suspects were interviewed and evidence collected, but nothing came from the case, and it went cold. Police even looked into Jack, the last person to see Eve alive. Jack was called out to Long Island. Police were keeping him as a person of interest in the case, seeing as they had spent the last night together since she went missing. Jack understood the process and cooperated with officials. Fortunately for him, a medical student from whom he had bought a stereo showed up to deliver the package along with his father. Both men were able to provide an alibi for Jack's whereabouts on Saturday morning. He also had to undergo a lie detector test to prove his innocence. In the 90s, though, 2 detectives showed up at his home and spoke to him before getting a DNA swab as part of evidence for future testing. All the while, the terror of being the next target remained with Irene. She worked as a nanny and shared an apartment with her son. This was in part due to her fear of living alone. 4 years Irene became the advocate in finding Eve's killer. 4 years Irene became the advocate in finding Eve's killer. Being the only sibling, Irene had no one but her father to turn to when in doubt. Unfortunately, he too passed away in February 2010 before knowing who was responsible. Irene kept the memory of Eve alive by giving interviews to local newspapers each year on the anniversary of Eve's murder. She went on to study, work, and marry. She raised 2 children and divorced before moving away from Long Island, living with the fear of being the target of a killer. Her pursuit for justice had her keeping up with detectives every few weeks, following up with leads and being active in the case. Although police were trying, DNA testing had not yet progressed to an advanced stage. Then in February 2018, Irene's son told her about the genetic genealogy testing used to identify the Golden State Killer. There was renewed hope. In January 2019, Irene contacted famous genealogist C. Moore. However, Morse said that she could not get involved as New York didn't yet allow the technique to be used in a criminal investigation. New York was one of the states hesitant to use the technology as privacy advocates feared the government's misuse of people's personal data. It was going to be a rigorous process, one that would take months or years. The State Department of Health required a private lab to obtain a permit which at the time was not being granted in the case. Irene pleaded with Suffolk County Police Lieutenant Kevin Bauer, who was a homicide investigator and oversaw Eve's case, to find a way. Bauer, too, was frustrated by the circumstances. But by December 2019, Suffolk County authorities found a loophole. Since the FBI helped with the original investigation, they were not restricted to New York laws. The semen sample lifted from Eve's body was sent to their labs with permission from the New York Department of Health. Agreeing to this, the FBI began the process of testing. And in July 2021, one of the agents specializing in genetic genealogy told investigators she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, the common surname being Rice. Working with the information they had and several background checks, they found a direct name, Herbert Rice. Herbert, though, had been long dead by the time. He succumbed to cancer in 1991. Looking back into the original investigation, Rice was not considered a suspect despite a sweeping investigation of the area. He did have a few records of arrests for nonviolent crimes, but none that required he submit a DNA sample. At the time of the murder, Herbert was living with his mother after his then-wife kicked him out of their home. His mother's residence was just 4 houses away from the crime scene. Records show that Rice's mother was questioned following the murder, but she said she didn't notice anything unusual during the time. Suffolk County Police Detective Jerry Battery had a possible name, and now he needed DNA confirmation before he could break the news to Irene. Detectives tracked down family members of Rice and came upon one of his sons. Failing to obtain a covert sample, Battery just walked up to the son's door and knocked. Hesitant at first, Rice's son eventually allowed Battery and his team to take a DNA swab. Once detectives explained their purpose for the visit, he explained that he had not shared a close relationship with his father. Rice's son and ex-wife filled much of the missing details surrounding the mystery. Although he was not responsible for Eve's murder, Rice's son still wished he could apologize for the actions of his father to the Wilkawitz family. In August 2021, the DNA sample proved that Rice was the killer as his son's DNA sample provided the missing familial link. Battery, accompanied by other detectives, knocked on the door of Irene Wilkawitz and gave her the news that she'd been long waiting to hear. Irene admitted to expecting the worst, that detectives would tell her that they had hit a dead end. Falling into the arms of her son Evan, whom she had named in memory of Eve, the nightmare that long haunted her waking hours came to an end. For 42 years, this is all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over. My goal was to be a mom. And beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me, she said. They explained to Eve the process of finding Herbert Rice, and after the meeting, Irene said she was open to talking to Rice's son. He too told detectives he would consider the option. Irene thanked all investigators for their outstanding dedication to the case and in solving Eve's murder. I just want to say thank you, said Irene, and how sorry I feel for him and his family to know that a family member is responsible for a crime like this, and they have to live knowing that. It's horrible for them as well. Before announcing the case being solved, investigators obtained a search warrant to exhume Rice's body. The results of testing came back positive on March 23, 2022, nearly 42 days to the date of Eve's kidnapping. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Harrison praised genetic genealogy for the ability to help them find the killer. Bayworth praised Irene for her enduring faith in finding Eve's killer. He said she was the real star of the case. In the years that passed, Jack Dempsey wrote on a blog about the feelings that consumed him following Eve's brutal murder. He writes about the impact her death had on his emotions and the periods of heartache. He likens her loss to a cosmic iron wall that he needed to climb to find release. At the end, though, he thanked her for the inspiration she gave him and the guidance she still provides as he makes his way up into the world of writing. In his blog, Dempsey encapsulates the emotions felt by all those who had the privilege of knowing Eve and now feeling the void of her loss. For Irene, though, There will always be unanswered questions. I can't ask him anything. Why did he do it? There are no real answers. No reason why, she said. Irene wants her sister to be remembered not just as a story being retold to the media. She was a real person and she liked to be a big sister to me. I want people to know that, she said. Super Bowl Sunday, 1989. While America celebrated the San Francisco 49ers winning over the Cincinnati Bengals, the Rogers family suffered in silence without any word from their beloved sister and daughter, Cynthia. Cynthia Rogers was a 27-year-old biologist working on Parkinson's disease research at the National Institute of Health. She was living alone in an apartment complex in the Forestville area of Prince George County. Her family last heard from her on the morning of January 22, 1989. According to her family, she planned on doing some grocery shopping. She had been on her way to the local store along the familiar tree-lined path used by locals. Unknown to Cynthia, evil lurked among the trees waiting for an opportunity to strike. For 5 days, Cynthia's continued silence fueled her family to begin a search for her that would end in tragedy. Her body was discovered on January 27, 1989, dumped alongside a dirt path strewn with litter in a wooded area of Forestville. Detective Bernie Nelson described the attack as extremely vicious. Cynthia suffered multiple blunt force injuries to her head and upper body. She was sexually assaulted and eventually strangled to death. Described as a free spirit and someone who loved watching birds and taking long walks, Cynthia's death left a void in the lives of her loved ones. For her mother, Lorie Rogers, there was no healing. It's just a big hole, she told Fox 5 during an interview in February 2001. It's just a big old hole, By then, it had already been 12 years since Cynthia's murder, and investigations had hit a stumbling block. Although DNA evidence collected at the scene was used to rule out possible suspects, the sample was still not strong enough to enter into the FBI database. The profile that the FBI was able to develop from the sample wasn't strong enough to meet the standards entered into the database. But it is something we can work with given the name of someone we can approach and obtain their DNA and compare it directly to the sample, said Nelson. But there was no name. No suspects ever appeared on the radar in connection to Cynthia's murder. However, on January 24, 2022, the case was revived by investigators, not without the help of Cynthia's cousin, Dawn. She had been working tirelessly to find new methods of technology that could help detectives solve the case that had haunted their family for far too long. She spent years probing detectives and inquiring about DNA advancements until she finally had her voice heard. I've been making any efforts I could to keep this case in the forefront. It's a glimmer of hope in general that my efforts were not in vain, said Dawn. New technology meant DNA could be retested using newer methods of analysis. Investigators found their suspect, James Clinton Cole, a 64-year-old convict already serving a life sentence. Cole's records painted a picture of a dark criminal past. He was charged with a misdemeanor assault in 1984, a destruction of property charge just days before Cynthia's murder, and a charge of child abuse in 1995. In February 2009, the long arm of the law finally caught up to Cole when his DNA matched to a rape investigation back in 1996. The girl had been walking behind Benjamin Stoddart Middle School when she was accosted by the suspect of knife point. He then forced her into the wooded area where he proceeded to rape her. Before fleeing, he tied her hands and feet with scraps of material. She was able to free herself and sought help at a nearby residence. Police questioned the girl, who described her attacker as a medium-complexioned black man. He had short hair, was 6 feet tall, and was wearing a black and white striped shirt. The similarities between the crime scenes provided police with an understanding of how Cole planned his attacks. He was an opportunistic criminal. He was arrested and charged for the rape of the 12-year-old girl that occurred on the August 20, 1996. He received 2 life sentences and during his imprisonment was linked to the murder of Cynthia through advanced DNA testing. He's currently serving a sentence at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. Cole was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and several other offenses against Cynthia. It's unclear when he'll appear in court, but Cynthia's family want to be there when it does happen. For her mother, Lorie, the news has made things lighter. It makes us feel better. In my heart, I feel lighter, she said. But she wants her moment with her daughter's killer. I really want to see this person who did this face to face, says Rosia. For Cynthia's brother, Philip Rogers, the burden has been lifted to a certain point. There will never be a full recovery because of the incident, but we have had some relief, he stated. Investigators do not believe Cynthia and Cole knew each other. They've concluded that Cole may have seen a young, petite woman who proved to be an easy target for his sinister intentions. For 3 decades, the mystery of Nona Stami Cobb's murder eluded investigators. Nona's body was found along I-77 on the northbound side in Surrey County on July 7, 1992 in the early morning. A female witness who remained anonymous last saw her getting into a truck on the night of July 6, 1992 at the Welcome Center on Interstate 55 in Cleveland County. The truck was being driven by an unidentified white male. Nona was a 29-year-old widow with a 3-year-old son named Josh. She spiraled into drug addiction and, 7 months before her murder, had lost custody of Josh. Her sister, Vicky S. Gregory, was raising the boy together with her husband. Vicky, though, maintained that Nona was a loving mother who loved her son and family deeply. She loved us and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her, she said. Nona was found strangled to death by a passing driver on the highway with very little evidence apart from DNA on her clothing and semen on her body. There were no suspects police could pinpoint at the time. Then in April 1995, 3 years after Nona's murder, interest was revived following the confession of a known serial killer. Sean Patrick Goebel came forward and confessed to the murders of 3 women. Goebel allegedly targeted sex workers and transported them across states before dumping their bodies along interstates. He confessed to the murders of Brenda K. Hadji, aged 45, Sherry 2 Mansour, aged 34, and Rebecca Haynes, aged 36. His modus operandi seemed to match that of Nona's murder. However, DNA testing cleared Goebel as a suspect in Nona's murder after the semen sample did not match with Goebel's DNA profile. Investigators were back to square one. It wasn't until April 2021 that new technology would help solve the decades-old mystery. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Surrey County Sheriff's Office, and Identifinders International collaborated to catch a killer. Using the latest method in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, investigators together with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, president and founders of Identifinders International, identified 71-year-old Warren Luthin Alexander. By using DNA submitted from family members, investigators were able to narrow down the suspect list and identify Alexander through the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene. Alexander was arrested at his home in Diamond Head, Mississippi on March 15, 2022 and held at the Hancock County Jail. He was extradited back to North Carolina on March 27, 2022 and has been jailed without bond. He was charged with the murder in the death of Nona Stami Cobb. The investigation is ongoing as many other homicides along the interstate remain unsolved. Police have not directly linked Alexander to other cases as of yet. Sheriff Steve Hyatt gave due credit to the investigators who worked on the case since 1992, stating that the groundwork done by the original investigative team allowed them to find Nona's killer 30 years later through proper evidence preservation. SBI Director Robert Shermier had some strong words for criminals. I want to send a clear message here. Hear my words. The men and women of the SBI, in partnerships with sheriff's offices across the state and around the country, will seek out justice for the cold cases that we have in our books. We will work day and night to pursue the suspects who think they may have gotten away with it 20, 30, 40 years ago, he said. I will tell you, genetic genealogy is a game changer, said Schermeyer. When investigators solved Diane Dawn's murder 34 years later, her son Mark Bayer, now 36 years old, was blown away by how the killing was solved. The only evidence ever recorded were fingernail scrapings and a hair from Diane's hands. Diane Lynn Dawn was a 29-year-old mother of 1. She was the first female radio repair technician at the San Diego Transit Company. Friends described her as a free spirit with a wicked sense of humor. She loved to draw and was a talented violinist. Diane also had a love for stock car racing and was often down at the El Cajon Speedway watching races. When Diane failed to show up for work on May 2, 1998, co-workers found this behavior out of character. Concern prompted one of them to drop by your Santee apartment to check up on her. What she found was horrifying. Diane's nude body lay in her bed. She had been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned to death. Her then 2-year-old son, Mark, was wandering around the apartment complex unsupervised. Police were called and investigations began, but the leads dried up quickly. Digging into Diane's past, there seemed to be no enemies, no vindictive exes or spouses, no spurned lovers, no motive for life insurance claims. It was not a case of sexual assault or robbery. The killer was a phantom. Despite questioning the maintenance man, there were no new leads and the case grew cold. Mark was adopted and raised by Diane's close friends, but often visited with her family in order to keep the memory of his mother alive. In an interview, Mark Bayer said that although he did have his family, there is a sense of loneliness knowing you've lost your mother. Looking back at some of the struggles that you go through, you kind of feel alone because of what you went through, he said. In the year's February 2001, with technology progressing, investigators tried once more to test the DNA found at the crime scene. Putting it through a federal DNA database from unsolved crimes yielded no results. The sample was not strong enough. In 2010, a cold case team took another crack at the case. This time, they scoured the evidence looking for clues that may have been overlooked. The hair found in Diane's hands was matched to the DNA scrapings taken from underneath her nails. It was a match proving Diane fought back. The sample was put through Cody's this time. However, no matches were made. This meant Diane's killer didn't commit other serious crimes or was smooth enough not to be caught. Then in 2020, the cold case team joined forces with the crime lab and utilized the new technology known as genetic genealogy. By tracing genetic profiles of family members to DNA found at unsolved crime scenes, suspects who would have gotten away with crimes were able to be traced. The sheriff's department released a statement with regard to the methods they used to track Diane's killer. They said that it was important to know that genetic genealogy was a last resort in solving homicide cases. Over the years, all avenues had been exhausted. It was most likely the case would have gone unsolved had it not been for the new technology. Using the single strand of hair and samples of DNA scrapings, investigators were able to match the DNA to possible relatives on the genealogy database. It was an exhaustive task, but pure determination brought with it results. Investigators and genealogists poured over 1,300 DNA samples of possible relatives and created 9 family trees before a single common name popped up, Warren Robertson. Robertson was never on the radar as a suspect in the case. He was a local tow truck driver who also lived in the same apartment complex as Diane. He too was known to enjoy stock car racing and did visit the El Cajon Speedway on occasion. However, investigators found no link between the two and could not determine if they had known each other. Robertson was born in Arkansas, but spent the major part of his life in San Diego. After the murder, he moved to Lakeside, leaving his family behind. He eventually moved to Indiana in 1989. Robert, it seemed, had no criminal past, his most serious offense being the murder of Diane. Unfortunately for the family of Diane, justice was not to be served. Robertson died 21 years prior to the discovery of Diane's murderer. He was killed during a house fire in Indiana in November 1999, aged 39. For Diane's family, getting the answer to the who brought with it a sense of relief. Bayer remained satisfied with the outcome, even though the killer will not see justice served. The answers that my family received is closure, and closure is everything even after so much time has passed, he said. Bayer went on to say that he heard many good things about his mother from friends and family. She was a good person. Everything I have ever been told and heard about her is that she was a good person, and I like to think that those values have transferred off to me, and I do my best to be a good person. The world could always use more good people, he said. Diane's younger sister, Victoria Dan Minter, said she was grateful to investigators who helped solve the case. I don't think anything was ever going to come of this. I thought I myself was going to go to my grave not knowing, as well as my mother and father, she said. When they came back and said they got a hit, it probably was, other than the birth of my children, the best day of my life. She can now rest in peace. At least there's an answer, but it doesn't make the pain any better, said Victoria. The sheriff's office said in a statement, this murder would likely have gone unsolved if not for the use of investigative genetic genealogy. In January 1999, police responded to calls from a neighbor reporting screaming from a residence in the 1300 block of Carlson Boulevard. The screaming reportedly lasted over 30 seconds before all went silent. At first, he tried to go round and check on this neighbor himself, but thought twice and called 911 instead. When police arrived, they found the front door locked. The back door, though, was left ajar. Inside, officers discovered the body of Mikia Wadley on her bedroom floor. She was dead, but her body was still warm to the touch. Her hands were bound with shoelaces, and she had been raped before being smothered to death. A buck knife was found underneath her body. At just 28 years old, Mikia's young life was snatched away brutally. She left behind an 18-year-old daughter and scores of family members who remember her fondly and never stopped chasing the truth. Her sister, Mikia Wadley, described her as an outgoing person, always smiling and making friends. She had the same group of friends since elementary school, the same group of friends now. Just a sweet person, she said. Mikia's niece, Davini Peterson, said her aunt was someone people always loved having around and hanging around. My favorite auntie. She was beautiful, outgoing, and smart. She loved hanging out and having fun, she said. Police began an intensive investigation. Initially, investigators focused on a man she had spent time with the previous evening. Other than him, there were no other leads. He, however, was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. The case grew cold as the only person of interest was ruled out. For the next 20 years, though, police continued to follow up on the case by testing the DNA found under Mikia's fingernails and a bloodstain found in the bedroom. In February 2002, a mixed DNA profile was created from the swabs collected from Mikia's hands and the bloodstain. The profile was submitted to the Department of Justice to search their offender database. This yielded no results. 18 years later, in 2020, additional DNA testing was done, this time focusing on previously untested fingernail clippings and ligatures. This provided authorities with a male DNA profile. In October of the same year, the DNA profile created by the Contra Costa County Crime Lab was submitted to the DOJ's DNA Data Bank program. This was done to conduct a familial search of the state's DNA index system. In April 2021, the DOJ's investigation revealed a person who was potentially a first-degree relative of the suspected perpetrator. The relative, though, was ruled out as a suspect. Police, however, had a suspect name but were keeping the revelation quiet until they could find a confirmed sample. It was going to be difficult because the suspect was already dead. Detectives were able to track down an immediate relative of the suspect in September 2021. A buccal swab was obtained and submitted to the crime lab for testing. That same month, investigators received the confirmation they needed. Mikia's killer was identified as 35-year-old Jerry Lee Henderson. Henderson was someone who was known to Mikia. They shared a mutual friend and often stayed over at the same friend's house. But Henderson had overstayed his welcome. When the mutual friend refused to house Henderson any longer, he instead went to bunk at Mikia's home, not expecting her to return home. Police believe this is when he attacked Mikia and fled the scene after the crime. Whispers abounded and rumors spread with regard to the nature of the crime. Mikia's sister, Kayla, cleared up the confusion surrounding the murder of her sister. Many people labeled the murder as a domestic violence dispute. She refuted the claims stating that Henderson and her sister were just friends who went to the same college. There had never been a romantic relationship between the two. So he was a friend of her friend Terry, and they both knew him. At a press conference on April 21, 2022, police revealed that the suspect was identified but had died 11 days after murdering Mikia from an apparent drug overdose. Acting Richmond Police Chief Louis Torona withheld the name. So we're 1% confident that he is the murderer. I don't want to give him any honor by mentioning who that might be. who wore shirts printed with her photo to show their undying support, to stand up and be heard. Mikia's niece, Devani, raised her hand to get Tarina's attention. Why is it okay that he's a secret? We know what he did. Why can't the family know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer, she said. We know what he did. Why the family can't know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer. Tarina responded by asking her, why give someone fame and notoriety for a murder? Why give somebody fame and notoriety for committing such a murder? Attendees at the press conference supported the family's request demanding that authorities give them the closure they deserved. Bowing to pressure from the crowd, Tarina finally named Henderson as a suspect in Mikia's murder. After the press conference, Mikia's sister, Mikia Wadley, spoke to Oxygen.com to iron out a few details. She said the press conference didn't do the story justice and it felt hurtful and humiliating. She told the news outlet that Mikia actually made it to the hospital, that she herself saw the staff working on her. The identification of Henderson, though, had brought some sense of closure to the family and their justice was served. Kayla stated that Mikia fought back, and that was what ultimately helped investigators find and recover the DNA needed to find Henderson. Mikia would have turned 50 this year and been a proud grandmother. Her daughter is now a mother herself, said Kayla. When given the opportunity to speak at the press conference, Kayla simply said that the time of seeking answers for deaths of family members needed to stop. Those communities needed to end the senseless violence. In a statement released by California Attorney General Rob Bonta, he said that it was his sincere hope that this resolution brings the family of Mikia Wadley a measure of peace. Bonta reiterated that no stone will remain unturned to secure justice and find the truth. Nothing can ever bring back a loved one, but we're committed to doing all that we can to help bring the truth to light in the fight for justice, he said. Get to the hospital. These were the words uttered in a phone call made by the younger brother of Kevin Drinks. The family rushed to the hospital assuming Kevin was involved in an accident, only to discover he'd been killed in a shooting. Those 4 words continued to haunt Kenya Drinks for 10 years until the men responsible for killing her husband Kevin were finally brought to justice. Kevin, who was 50 years old, was gunned down on December 10, 2011. He was parked behind Underground Market Furniture in North Philadelphia. He had just started work 4 days prior as a delivery driver. He was shot 3 times just after 6:30 p.m. and was rushed to hospital where he died shortly after arriving. For the family, it was a puzzling situation. Anyone who knew Kevin knew he was a doting grandfather who regularly went to church and sang gospel songs. To him, family was everything. For Kenya, though, she had lost the love of her life. Kevin and Kenya met back in 1978, high school sweethearts who attended their Germantown High School prom together. However, they broke up after graduation. 2 decades later, they reconnected after Kenya's mother passed away in the year February. Kevin stopped by to pay his respects. The rest was history. Kevin was a divorcee, but that didn't stop Kenya from making the best of this second chance. The two married in February 2001 with Kevin serenading Kenya as she walked down the aisle. 10 years later, in 2011, they bought their dream home together in Ronhurst. For the next few months, they would spend time in their home filling it with a shared love for each other. Kevin loved his family and enjoyed spending time with his 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Those were the last few months Kenya would share with her beloved husband. No one could foresee the call from Kevin's younger brother that was the end to the fairy tale she was building with Kevin. The only question on everyone's mind was, who would want to kill Kevin? Nothing panned out from the investigations made by police. People began to whisper that maybe there was something more to the killing. The home she built with Kevin became a shell of its former glory. But Kenya and Kevin's family didn't back down. She persisted with keeping up the investigation with police. T-shirts and buttons featuring Kevin's face were printed and distributed. Flyers were constantly circulated to ensure the memory of his case remained alive. The Justice for Kevin Drinks movement began. Kenya called upon elected officials to take action and shut down the whispers of Kevin being involved in underhand dealings. Frustration grew as other cases were being solved, But the Drinks family persisted in their unwavering belief that justice would be served. A month after Kevin's murder, Kenya called upon State Representative W. Curtis Thomas. There is a vigil and news conference organized by Thomas. We all must begin to take ownership and responsibility in our communities and stand up against the lawless element that's committed the crime. What happened to Kevin Drinks could happen to any of us, said Thomas. Thomas went on to implore community members to join in community policing. He said that everyone needed to come together in order to stop this senseless violence. Thomas called for the formation of a police substation along the busy corridor and an increase in bike patrols and beat cops. Captain Branville G. Bard agreed with Thomas and added to the sentiment felt by many present at the vigil. This is our community and we live here. We are imploring people to speak up, he said. He mentioned that every day that passes and Kevin's murderer goes without being caught showed that people just didn't care. The vigil fed a fire in Kenya until time started to get the best of her and her faith in justice. Kenya prayed. She eventually moved away from the painful memories and also out of fear for her safety. Over time, though, her faith began to dwindle. Kenya understood the police were overwhelmed but sometimes wondered if Kevin's case was even being worked on. But frustration grew. Kenya feared the case was going to grow ice cold. Slowly, she stopped calling the police as frequently as she used to. Kenya said her calls were often met with a patronizing attitude. She grew disappointed, questioning what was so hard in finding Kevin's killer. Her faith was further knocked when police were able to solve the killing of a fellow officer who was killed after Kevin. Killing an officer is the highest level of disrespect. I understand that, but if the department were willing to pull every stop to find someone who shot one of their own, why couldn't they do that for Kevin? She asked. Kenya became vocal about the lack of action in Kevin's case. I want justice for every murder victim in the city. If you take an oath to protect us, you should treat us the same as you would an officer, she said. She waited, biding her time as the case grew colder. Years passed with no new leads or feedback, and then there was a break in the case. In February 2018, she got the call she had been waiting for. It was a bittersweet moment when Kenya and her family discovered that Kevin was killed in a case of mistaken identity. Philadelphia Police Detective John Verrecchio had been listening in on recordings of jailhouse conversations. They were investigating a different case through the coded conversations between prisoners when he stumbled across a conversation related to Kevin's case. 2 months before Kevin was killed, Chad Reynolds had been accused of murdering a 22-year-old man named Kristen Freeman. Randalls was worried about a witness that was going to testify against him. So he plotted with 3 other men, Michael Blackston, Samaj Armstead, and Rezhan Combs. The men were discussing the description of the witness, his workplace, and the kind of car he drove. They were formulating a plot to kill him and went through with it in December 2011. The witness they wanted to silence bore a striking resemblance to Kevin Drinks. They had killed the wrong man. The jailhouse conversation led to the convictions of the 4 men. In March 2022, all 4 men were found guilty of murder, conspiracy, and related charges in the death of Kevin Drinks. Reynolds, Blackston, and Armstead were found guilty in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment. Combs was given the lesser charge of third-degree murder. His sentencing was due to be heard on June 29th. It was later revealed that Michael Blackston was accused of killing 5 other people, with police saying the number qualified him as a serial killer. Following the sentencing, Kenya praised the work done by Assistant District Attorney Ashley Toxilowski and Christian Wynn. She also thanked Witness-Victim Coordinator Kathy Lees and called them her dream team. District Attorney Larry Krasner held a press conference in April 2022 near the place where Kevin was gunned down. Krasner told everyone present that Drinks was under surveillance for an entire day before he was killed in a case of mistaken identity. He then invited Kenya to speak. Though nervous at first, she took the stand and looked at the button that read "Justice for Kevin Drinks," the one she and her family and friends had worn for a decade. Then she spoke. "Family, take the buttons off. Justice is done. Justice is served. We don't need those buttons anymore." For Kenya, her eyes have been opened to the number of families who, like her, still wait for answers surrounding the unsolved murders of their loved ones. One such person was a woman who stood by Kenya through the trial, Kathy Lees. Kathy confided to Kenya that her own son, Justin Reyes, was gunned down just 6 months prior to Kevin's murder. The case remains unsolved, but by seeing Kenya's persistence and ultimate victory in getting the answers she needed, Kathy has hoped that she too would one day find the answers to her own son's murder. For 3 decades, the death of 22-year-old Susan Amy Morse baffled investigators. However, investigators now believe that they may have found the man responsible for the murder of Susan and a separate sexual assault that occurred in the same apartment complex a year later. When Susan failed to show up for work on August 16, 1989, her parents grew concerned. They requested police do a welfare check as Susan's absence was uncharacteristic behavior. Susan lived alone in the Mesa apartment. Police entered the apartment, which was eerily quiet, and made a gruesome discovery. Susan had been beaten and asphyxiated with an extension cord. The covers of her bed pulled up around her body. Police later discovered she had also been sexually assaulted. There were no leads despite police canvassing the area and asking neighbors questions. No information surfaced and the case was pushed to the back burner. A year later, in November 1990, another incident occurred at the same apartment complex. A 23-year-old woman called police to report a break-in. She told police that she awoke to a man holding a knife to her stomach. He told her that he was not going to hurt her, just rape her. The man reportedly crawled in through an open window. He sexually assaulted the woman but left her alive. Her attacker then stole cash and a VCR before escaping. Following the second attack in the apartment complex, investigators look back at evidence from both crime scenes and determine that the crimes were connected. There was no suspect in the case, though. For years, both cases sat cold at the Mesa Police Department. Susan's parents unfortunately passed away before they could get the answers they wanted. The technology of the time was not as advanced to determine the DNA profile of the suspect responsible for the murder and sexual assault cases. The break in the unsolved cases came in March 2022. Through genetic genealogy testing, DNA recovered from both crime scenes were used to develop a family tree for the suspect. The search was narrowed down until one name popped up: Thomas Cox. Mesa Police Department Sergeant Chuck Trapani said it was constant searching for newer advanced technology and testing DNA that helped with the solving of cases. In the case of Thomas Cox and Susan Morse, it worked out dramatically. Cox, who is 58 years old, was identified through familial markers. What cemented investigators' pursuit of him was the fact that Cox's mother lived next door to Susan at the time of her murder. In initial investigations, he'd never been considered a person of interest in either case. Police staked out Cox's Colorado Springs home and recovered a styrofoam cup, lid, and straw. The DNA lifted from the recovered items matched that of the DNA found at both crime scenes. Furthermore, a print lifted from a screen that had been removed from one of the victim's windows matched the prints of Cox. These were already in the system after he committed several misdemeanors in the 80s and 90s. Cox was linked to another attack of an unnamed victim around November 13, 1990. In March 2022, Cox was indicted following the 1989 killing of Susan and the sexual assault at the same apartment complex in November 1990. He was charged with a total of 16 counts in both cases that included first-degree murder, sexual assault, burglary, and kidnapping. On April 23, 2022, Cox was extradited from El Paso County to Maricopa County. He was held on a $1 million cash bond. The FBI in Phoenix, who also assisted with the case, released a statement that read, "The passage of time does not deter law enforcement's persistence for truth and justice." Authorities were able to make contact with an aunt and cousin of Susan's who expressed their relief in having finally caught the man responsible for her death. On May 4, 2022, the Mesa Police Department released a statement from one of Cox's victims who wished to remain anonymous. In it, she said that she didn't believe this day would come. She was thankful for the work done by Detective Samuel and the Mesa Police Department. She also passed her deepest sympathies to the family of Susan Morse and said that "I didn't know Susan, but my fight became her fight, my pain became her pain, and my tears were her tears." She ended by saying that she learned how to stop being a victim and start being a survivor despite what Thomas Cox took from her that night. For the criminals in these cases, It may have taken decades before they were captured and made to answer for their crimes, but the law never stops. On August 25, 1995, a passerby discovered the remains of a woman in a sleeping bag along Pine Hill Road in Kitsap County. When police responded, they discovered the woman was naked and suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. She was later identified through her fingerprints as Patricia Barnes, a 61-year-old native of Seattle. Barnes was a somewhat well-recognized figure. People called her the Towel Lady, as she was often seen wearing a towel or bandana wrapped around her head. She was homeless and bounced between homeless shelters in Seattle. She was also known to frequent the Pioneer Square area. Police ruled their death a homicide and collected over 30 items of evidence from the crime scene. In an attempt to find leads, police canvassed the area and witnesses came forward with information regarding Barnes' whereabouts prior to the discovery. Some alleged to have seen her with a white male, aged 30 to 35 years old. The pair allegedly told another man they planned to eat at Courthouse Park before making their way to Federal Way. It was the first time they saw this man with her. No one saw Barnes again until her body was discovered dumped on the roadside. A composite sketch was drawn up, but no leads came from the picture after it was circulated. Police also believe Barnes may have been the victim of Robert Lee Yates, known as the Spokane serial killer, a murderer who had shot his victims before dumping their bodies in remote locations. Barnes did not exactly fit the profile of Yates' victims, but the similarities in the murder were striking. He was, however, ruled out when police discovered he was stationed in Alabama during the time of Barnes' murder. The case went cold. In February 2018, a renewed interest developed in solving cold cases following the use of genetic genealogy to track killers who had previously gone undetected. Barnes' case was reopened in February 2018 as part of a division-wide focus on past cold cases. Given the amount of physical evidence, investigators began looking through the pieces of the puzzle that was the Barnes murder. They re-interviewed past detectives and began exploring new DNA testing tools that had become available. This time around, Yates was excluded from the investigation as a thorough review of his movements placed him out of town during the time of Barnes' murder. In August 2020, acting on earlier information, a search warrant for DNA was executed in Houston, Texas with the assistance of the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Investigators followed up on a lead regarding a person of interest who was believed to be the last person to see Barnes alive. The DNA sample taken from the person did not match what was recovered from Barnes or the crime scene. Investigators pushed for further testing and discovered that a single unidentified male DNA profile was found on 3 separate evidence sources at the crime scene. The DNA was found on Barnes' body and matched that of a cigarette, but that was discarded near her body. After putting the profile into Cody's, there was still no match. Whoever had killed Barnes was not entered into the national database. With leads now exhausted despite the technology, KCSO partnered with Othram Labs. They were able to create a genealogical profile, and Othram Labs worked hard to narrow down to a specific person. There was a lead found in December 2021. Acting on the information, KCSO investigators followed the lead down to Nogales, Arizona. With assistance from the Arizona Police Department, they tracked down the identified suspect, Douglas Keith Crone. Crone was a career criminal. He had 5 felony convictions to his name according to records in Washington. This included a conviction for first-degree robbery in 1984. He was also arrested in Pierce County in 1994 for kidnapping in the second degree. For some reason, though, his DNA was not entered into any criminal database. In an ironic twist of fate, Crone was already dead. He had allegedly been electrocuted while installing a television antenna that hit a nearby power line in September 2016. It was his death, however, that helped investigators in identifying his connection to the DNA. With help from the Arizona Police Department and Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, biological material taken from Crone's postmortem was allowed to be used to match the DNA profile developed by investigators. In January 2022, Washington State Patrol Crime Lab concluded the biological material from Crone's postmortem matched the DNA extracted from Barnes' crime scene and the discarded cigarette butt. Kitsap County Sheriff's Office Detective Mike Grant called the cigarette but the linchpin that blew the case open. The evidence on the body could mean one of two or three different things. But when you have a cigarette but with the DNA and the DNA on our body and on items around our body, it was conclusive to me that we had the right guy, he said. Detectives also realized the initial composite sketch bared a striking resemblance to Crone, who would have been around 33 years old at the time of the murder. Grant reached out to the family of Barnes, who were described as being shocked and grateful that they have answers now after nearly 30 years of uncertainty. Lorie House was born in Las Vegas, Nevada on February 6, 1967. She was the third among four siblings. Growing up, Lorie cherished her friends and family as much as they cherished her. Attending Gunderson High School in San Jose, California, Lorie was a bright student who also participated in many sports. Her love for technology put her ahead of her time. Eventually, Lorie would go on to earn a well-established engineering position in one of the largest tech companies, Adobe Systems. Soon, she moved to Silicon Valley and was living in an apartment on Charleston Road in Santa Clara County. She reportedly also had a loving relationship with her boyfriend who has never been named. On September 5, 1992, Lorie left for work, but she never arrived there. On the same day, during his regular run, a jogger made a gruesome discovery on the 1300 block of Crittenden in Mountain View, now the site of Google's campus. A woman was found dead in the passenger seat of her car near a garbage dump. Authorities were notified about the discovery, and they identified the woman as 25-year-old Lorie House. A nylon rope was still around her neck, which suggested she had been strangled to death. The crime scene did not hold many clues for investigators. Latent footprints were found both inside and outside of her car. Lorie's footprints were found on the dashboard indicating that a struggle had occurred. However, it was not a robbery. Her wallet was found nearby undisturbed. Lorie was found just 2 miles away from her workplace. Initially, investigators focused on the boyfriend as an obvious suspect. Yet, he was ruled out later when his fingerprints did not match the fingerprints found on Lorie's car. However, the prints matched another person who was close to him, his roommate John Kevin Woodward's. John was someone who could absolutely have been the assailant. Not only were his fingerprints in Lorie's car, but he had a possible motive too. Allegedly, John was not a fan of Lorie. He was somewhat jealous of her as he had growing romantic feelings towards his roommate, her boyfriend. Besides that, Lorie's success in the tech world, a place that was dominated by males in the 90s, was something else that irked him greatly. When Lorie's boyfriend asked him if he killed Lorie, he did not give him a straight answer. Instead, he asked what information the investigators had. This behavior was both strange and suspicious. A month after the killing, John Woodward's was arrested for murder. At the 1995 trial, John's defense claimed that he had inadvertently left fingerprints on Lorie's car because it was parked in front of his house some days before the murder. Prosecutors could not place him inside the vehicle. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. A second trial was held in 1996, but also resulted in a hung jury and was declared a mistrial. A judge dismissed the charges, saying he could not be charged again without new evidence. After the second trial, John moved to the Netherlands. Despite the possible suspect and developments made in the case early on, this case went cold. However, the investigation remained open. 30 years later, detectives successfully connected John Woodward's, now 58 and a software firm CEO, to Lorie House's murder. With the help of new DNA technology, they were able to extract new evidence from the original crime scene and compare it with John's DNA. His DNA matched the DNA found on the rope tied around Lorie's neck. In July 2022, after police received a tip that John was heading back to the U.S., they caught him at JFK Airport after he landed. He was arrested in New York, where he's currently being held pending extradition to California. If found guilty, he's facing life in prison. The family stated after the arrest that this is not a win because they still don't get to have their sister back, but they're hopeful that they will finally get some justice for her. Susan Winters. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966 to Danny and Avis Winters in Oklahoma. Her parents and older brother, Christopher, adored her from the day she was born. In 1984, Susan was phenomenal in both studies and sports. She led her high school softball team to the state championship. She kept running and won her age bracket in marathons. She went on to study law after obtaining a graduate degree in political science from Oklahoma University. Her career flourished from the start. She worked for a year in the Clark County District Attorney's Office, toiled at a Las Vegas law firm, and sometimes filled in as a judge in North Las Vegas Justice Court. While Susan succeeded well in her career, it was time for her to start a family. She married Brent Dennis in August 1995, a psychologist by profession. Their first daughter, Avis L., was born 4 years later in October 1999. The family welcomed a second daughter, Anna Danielle, in April 2002. Susan was passionate about every aspect of her life. She was an avid reader, a marathon runner, an animal lover, and a devoted mother and wife. Despite being a hard-working attorney at her workplace, she dedicated all her free time to her family. It would all change on January 3, 2015. At 6:48 a.m. that day, Susan's husband, Brent Dennis, called 911 after finding his 48-year-old wife unresponsive in bed. Paramedics quickly arrived to find Susan holding on to life, and she was taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, at 2:26 p.m. Susan passed away after Dennis instructed doctors to take his wife off life support. According to Dennis, his wife committed suicide. He claimed he found 2 bottles of antifreeze in the garage and assumed that Susan had drunk the antifreeze at some point. When asked why his wife committed suicide, Dennis told police that he and Susan had been fighting for quite some time. Susan was drinking while on antidepressant medication for depression and threatened to kill herself many times. Dennis also claimed he slept the entire night and woke up to find Susan unresponsive. According to the coroner's report, Susan died of a combination of ethylene glycol poisoning and oxycodone intoxication. Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze, so her death has been ruled a suicide. However, the strangest thing in this case was that no evidence in the bedroom showed Susan harmed herself. Detectives found no suicide note, no glass with antifreeze remnants of liquid in it, and no prescription bottles or antifreeze containers, an impossible scenario regarding the probability of suicide. Although Susan's death was already deemed a suicide and the case was closed, the Winters family was not ready to accept that she chose to take her own life. In 2016, Susan's parents, Danny and Avis Winters, hired retired FBI detective and attorney Tony Sergo, who filed a civil lawsuit against Brent Dennis on their behalf. Apparently, the suit alleges that Susan died under suspicious circumstances and blames her demise on Dennis, who had a financial motive. Indeed, Dennis was very keen on the financial benefit that originated from his wife's death. He stood to benefit from a $1 million life insurance policy taken out on Susan's life. He was also the beneficiary of Susan's inheritance worth $1 million within 2 days of his wife's death. He was in talks with the insurance company. Apart from monetary benefits, Brent Dennis had a much darker secret. The more Sergo dug deeper, the more Dennis looked like a suspect. Sergo found many clues that have never been looked at before, clues that paint another picture of this respected Nevada psychologist. In his own investigation, Detective Sergo discovered significant evidence against Dennis, including a substance abuse addiction and a connection to a man named Jeffrey Crosby, who had a past conviction of selling cocaine. During his civil deposition, Dennis admitted to buying drugs from Crosby. What was the mechanism through which he would purchase controlled substances from Jeffrey? Pay him cash and he would provide me substance. When the secret was out, Susan was mad. The situation deteriorated in such a way that Dennis had to seek treatment for his drug abuse. Phone records showed 6 calls and texts from Susan's phone to Crosby's phone in the days before her death. She allegedly called Crosby to inform him she was going to the authorities. Susan wanted her husband to stop using drugs. But the addiction did not stop there. It was revealed that Susan had previously threatened to report his alleged drug use to authorities. Cell phone records obtained by the family lawyers showed she called and sent text messages to Crosby several times in the days before her death, to stop him from selling drugs to Dennis. Interestingly enough, she confided in some friends that her marriage was falling apart the day before she died. Avis and Danny insisted Susan did not kill herself. According to her parents, she was a bit upset, but in no way did that lead to her committing suicide. In fact, Susan purchased airline tickets to San Jose, California, Atlanta, and Hawaii to attend her daughter Anna's cheerleading competitions. Susan's parents said she was really excited that Anna would be attending college. Dennis had previously claimed that Susan had searched for antifreeze several times before her death, which made him believe that she took her own life by consuming antifreeze. But months later, investigators discovered that the last of the searches for antifreeze poisoning was done at 5:15 a.m., when Susan was already unconscious and nearly dead. Dennis also traveled to Orleans to meet with Crosby on 4 occasions after her death between January 9, 2015 and March 27, 2015. After consistent insistence from the Winter family and with newfound clues, detectives decided to revisit the case. In February 2017, during a traffic stop near his home, Dennis was arrested on suspicion of open murder with a deadly weapon. Allegedly, he received prescription painkillers from his own patients. Interestingly, even at the time of his arrest, he had 3 painkiller pills in his right pocket. He was formally charged with voluntary manslaughter after being taken into custody. In April 2017, Susan's manner of death was changed from suicide to undetermined following Dennis' arrest. While Dennis remained free on $250,000 bail, he entered an Alford plea in which he does not admit guilt, but concedes the prosecutors have sufficient evidence to prove his guilt. 4 years after Susan's tragic demise, Dennis was finally sentenced to serve 3 to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter in connection with the February 2015 death of his wife. While the Winters family is relieved by the outcome, Susan's daughters, who are now 22 and 20 years old, stood by their father. In a statement in court, they wrote that their father only entered the Alford plea in the case to avoid the harsher punishment, but had nothing to do with their mother's death. Whatever the outcome is, Susan's parents expressed their grief over losing contact with their granddaughters. While Susan is never coming back, hopefully, the two families can find their way back to each other through the healing process. Barbara Jean Jeepson. Barbara Jean Jeepson, a newly married 18-year-old, started her new life with her husband, Joe Jeepson, in a lovely home in Van Nuys, California. As a National Air Guard, Joe earned a good living. So it's not a surprise that they planned to extend their family soon after marriage. They married in 1955 and Barbara conceived her first child that same year. By January of 1956, Barbara was in her 4th month of pregnancy. January 31, 1956 was a normal day when Joe left his home for work early in the morning. Feeling bored at home, Barbara went shopping later in the day. Locals saw her around 12:30 p.m. She returned home soon after. When Joe returned home from work, a bloody scene awaited him. In the bedroom, Joe discovered Barbara's naked body on the mattress with a 10-inch butcher's knife stuck in her chest. Joe covered his wife with a blanket and then called the police. As detectives reached the crime scene, they found several items of evidence. A military green jacket with blood traces was found a few feet away from Barbara's body. Some hair follicles from an unknown person were also found in the garage. However, important items such as bed sheets, pillow covers, and a bloody rug found in the sink were not collected since DNA technology was not available back then. The body was sent for examination and reports came back stating that she had been killed sometime between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. It was also mentioned that she had been sexually assaulted before being brutally stabbed to death. The crime scene showed no forced entry, no stolen items, nor any signs of struggle, which led investigators to believe that she might have known her attacker. Upon questioning neighbors, 2 witnesses came forward. One person said he saw a person who did not live in the community roaming around the area that day wearing a green jacket. Another witness saw a man with big hands and big knuckles. Barbara was considered another victim of a series of sexual assaults that were going on in the nearby area. Police questioned every person who had committed crimes like this in the area but could not link anyone to Barbara's murder. They initially suspected her husband, Joe, but he was eventually ruled out as it was proven that he was at work during the murder. With no suspects, detectives reached a dead end. Despite combing through the evidence over the years, the search for Barbara's killer would remain unsolved and her case would remain cold. In February 2016, DNA testing was completed on multiple items collected from the crime scene, but there was not enough DNA to submit the findings to the Cody's system for a match. Moreover, the suspect's DNA had most likely never been entered into the Cody's system. By February 2019, Los Angeles Police Detective Rachel Evans had joined the cold case unit. The very first case assigned to her was Barbara Jeepson's case. She set off re-examining the leads and looking for clues to identify the killer, which no detectives had been successful in doing for the past 60 years. It took her a whole week to read the entire case file the first time, yet she kept reading it again and again. By the third time, she picked up on a few things that had not been given much importance by previous investigators. She noted the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Barbara most likely knew her killer. No items were taken from the scene, pointing towards the motive not being robbery. Based on the assumption that Barbara knew her assailant, Evans started putting the pieces together and focused her investigation on one person, Monty Mertz. Born in 1911 in Utah, Mertz had several relationships over the years. He first got married to Cleo Rem in 1931, with whom he had one son and one daughter, but that marriage fell apart. After the divorce, he married another woman named Bernice, but that marriage also did not last long. In 1945, during the divorce, Bernice cited cruelty as a cause. Indeed, Mertz was a violent person. He was also a gambling addict, womanizer, animal torturer, and a raging alcoholic, an absolute degenerate to say the least. And yet, women kept falling for him. In 1948, he moved in with a woman named Fern Spiva in the San Fernando Valley after making her his common-law wife. He stayed with her for 6 years. Spiva had a 10-year-old daughter from a prior relationship. That daughter was Barbara. Evans believed he groomed and molested Barbara along the way because that was one of his sick habits. He'd marry these young women who had young girls, and then abuse them. In 1955, the year that Barbara got married, Mertz married another woman, his fourth wife who already had 2 children, including a young daughter. In 1960, 15-year-old Marian Pedrada, who had a horse stable next to Mertz's house and often rode horses with him, was stabbed 9 times and killed, but no one was linked to the murder. Then in 1962, Mertz married his 5th wife, Ina. She too had a young daughter. In 1964, Mertz was arrested for molesting a 14-year-old girl. Although Mertz was suspected of multiple sexual assaults, that was the only victim for which he was arrested. That same year, Mertz showed up at a hospital with a gunshot wound. He claimed he was injured in an accidental shooting, but others believed someone intentionally shot him. Although investigators never discovered who shot Mertz and why, people around Mertz believed that it was most likely from a confrontation regarding Mertz's past abusive behavior, as well as the possible connection to the murders of Barbara Jean Jeepson and Mary Ann Pedrada. In 1965, after his arrest for child abuse, Mertz was given a polygraph test by police who asked him about both the murders of Barbara Jeepson and Mary Ann Pedrada. He denied ever knowing Barbara, but later it was discovered that he had attended her funeral and often visited her mom even after Barbara's death. Evans said the polygraph test results concluded that Mertz had definite guilty knowledge regarding the fate of the 2 murdered women. But Mertz could not be prosecuted with this alone, as polygraph test results are not admissible evidence in court. However, after this, suspicion mounted and people started to notice that there was something wrong with him. One of the people who had suspected him was his own wife, Ina. She found the underwear of a young girl in a drawer in their house. On August 15, 1965, while he was out of jail, she confronted Mertz about whether he had been abusing the girl whose underwear he had. Suspicions already looming over him. This confrontation was the last straw, as Mertz then grabbed a gun and chased Ina outside to the street, shooting her multiple times and killing her. Afterwards, he returned to the house and killed himself. This murder-suicide would be the last depraved act in his pathetic criminal life. It was revealed that in 2017, a former stepdaughter of Mertz came forward to tell a shocking story. On the day that 15-year-old Pedrada was murdered, the then 10-year-old girl saw Mertz come back into the house with a bloody knife and blood on his hands and clothing. She was so terrified of Mertz that she waited 50 years to come forward with this information. Mertz apparently abused the girl physically and mentally by doing such things as stabbing her horse with a pitchfork. Despite being in her 60s, she said that the memories of Mertz still haunt her, and she's still afraid of him. Upon more digging, Evans learned that Mertz had a pattern of never leaving his victims alone, even after he remarried or when his stepdaughters grew up and moved out of the house. He would continue to abuse and sexually assault them until the time of his death. After some tiring research, Evans was able to track down Mertz's relatives still living in Utah. In September 2019, a search warrant for DNA was served on Mertz's 87-year-old son. Before the warrant, detectives were considering exhuming Mertz's body, but they were hopeful that the case could be solved by collecting his son's DNA. The son died just 2 weeks after giving his DNA to the detectives. Although there was not enough DNA to present, there was enough of a match to allow the cold case to be solved as per the standards of law enforcement with 99% certainty that Mertz was Barbara's killer. He was also suspected of other murders and assaults. Evans said he would be charged with first-degree murder if he were still alive. Although many of the people directly affected by this tragic murder have long since passed. The pursuit of the American dream draws many from far and wide. For Ming Tang, it was a chance to give his family a better life. However, that dream was snuffed out on the afternoon of April 26, 1993. Tang, a husband, father, and well-liked member of the San Carlos community, emigrated from Taiwan to California. A businessman at heart, Tang opened up a little mom and pop corner shop called the Devonshire Little Store. It was a hit with the community, and Tang was a welcoming and friendly store owner. The little shop thrived as the community grew to know and like the owner Tang. In a way, the corner shop that had always been a fixture in that part of town took on a new personality under the ownership of Tang, and it shocked the community when they learned that Tang had been shot and killed in the very store he'd owned. On the afternoon of April 26, 1993, San Carlos police officers responded to a 911 call for a possible shooting. Upon arrival minutes after the incident, officers found Tang, the store owner, bleeding out after sustaining a single gunshot wound. Emergency medical personnel rushed Tang to a nearby hospital. He, however, succumbed to his injuries soon after arriving at hospital. In the meantime, investigators were collecting information as eyewitnesses came forward to report that an adult female was seen fleeing the store soon after the shooting. She was described to be in her 20s with shoulder-length brown hair. The car she was driving was a 70s blue station wagon. Allegedly, Tang had been alone in the store when the incident occurred. Investigators maintained that the shooting was the result of a robbery gone wrong and were pursuing leads regarding the woman seen leaving the crime scene. The case received national attention and featured on America's Most Wanted. Although much attention was garnered by the crime, leads dried up for investigators. A reopening of the case in 2010 brought nothing new to the table. 8 years later, in 2018, it was an utter stroke of luck that brought the killer to justice. Oklahoma authorities were investigating an unrelated crime and stumbled upon a diary in a rural home in the town of Dewey, north of Tulsa. There they found a private journal titled Things I Regret. In it was an account of the slaying of a Korean man during a robbery in San Carlos in 1993. The owner of the diary, 61-year-old Rain Hoffman Ramos. She had been living in the rural house when police conducted the search. Another search was conducted at a residence in Sacramento by California officials on March 16, 2022. The searches, which were conducted simultaneously between California and Oklahoma, yielded supporting evidence against Hoffman Ramos. Records show that Hoffman Ramos was a repeat offender that had been arrested multiple times on drug-related and other nonviolent offenses. She was arrested and detained in Oklahoma awaiting extradition to California. Although the diary mentions a Korean man, Tang was Taiwanese. The details matched the scenario that the investigators developed of the crime. Hoffman Ramos waived her rights to an extradition hearing and was brought back from Oklahoma to California, where she made a brief appearance in San Mateo County Court on April 13, 2022. She was arraigned in court on April 26, 2022, 29 years to the date of Tang's murder. Hoffman Ramos was charged with murder in the death of Ming Tang. Sheriff's Lieutenant Jacob Trickett said that the purpose of a cold case unit was to have a fresh perspective and to utilize more updated information management systems. That's basically one of the reasons we were led back to Rain, he said. In July 1993, 3 months after the shooting, Tang's wife sold the store to another Taiwanese family. It had been a staple corner store for 87 years and remains open under new owner Chung Sun and his wife and Sunday son, who knows the family, said he still had questions about what took place. What happened 30 years ago? What did she do? He asked regarding the suspect. This gentleman never did a bad thing to any people, Sun told ABC7. San Carlos Mayor Sarah McDowell made a statement following the arrest of Hoffman Ramos. Mr. Tang was a husband, a father, and a friend who came to the United States to provide a better life for his family. His death shook the community of San Carlos and has remained a topic of discussion over the years. The Tang family have not spoken publicly, but authorities have been keeping them updated on the case and its proceedings. Sheriff Carlos G. Bolanos thanked the Tang family for their support over the years. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office would like to thank the Tang family for their support. I hope that your family will finally get the justice and closure that you deserve, he said to the Tangs. Patricia Stichler.